Welcome into the Fantasy Football Forge. It is time for class, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be looking at Marvin Harrison Jr., as you can already see up there on the whiteboard, green board, chalkboard, whatever we want to call it. Probably not a whiteboard. I hope you like the design there. I thought I did a nice job of making that look authentic, but who knows. So, I want to introduce this series. We'll be looking at Marvin Harrison Jr. This is supposed to be a relatively quick video, but this could be a little bit longer than some of the other videos. The question is, first of all, let me know in the comments, who do you want to see next? I've got a short list here of Zamir White, James Cook, George Pickens, David Njoku, DJ Moore, guys who I'm different than the community on, that I think, I could make the case for and show you why. But also, are there any players that, maybe I'm the same as the community, but you disagree on? Let me know who it is that you would like to see me justify whether their ADP is worth it or why maybe it's not worth it based on, for the most part, what we do, projecting, historical data, etc. So let's do this darn thing here. We're gonna start to look at Marvin Harrison Jr. Via the receptions number. We're gonna be making a projection here and then seeing that the projection lines up with what we can expect. So before I get into this, actually, I do also want to state Thursday, I don't know when I'm going to release this video, so maybe that happened yesterday, but Thursday nights, I will be live doing a draft. If you want to join in on those drafts, just, come in. I'll do underdog unless we can always do a sleeper draft and set something up there. So let me know if you want to do like a sleeper version instead. We can do that as well, but 9 o'clock on Thursday nights will be the nights for now. And there we go. Marvin Harrison Jr., receptions. We'll start off by looking at the pass attempts per game for the Arizona Cardinals last year was 32.6, which was 24th in the league, which means that they have room to go up there to get to average. And the average was about 34 attempts per game. And if we look at when Kyler Murray was on the field, they did actually pass a little bit more, 33 and a half attempts. So that's about average. So we're just going to use that number, that 33 and a half number. Remember, that's a little bit below average. So if anything, maybe we're being a little bit conservative with this number. And the completion percentage of Kyler Murray's, I calculated about 66%, and I ended up using the number 65% for these calculations. So just keep that in mind as well. Another number that we're just going to be a little bit conservative on. Continuing looking at getting this reception number, now we need to figure out, well, okay, we know how many attempts per game, but how many times is the ball going to get thrown towards Marvin Harrison Jr.? We know the completion percentage, roughly, that we can expect. We know the amount of attempts total in a game, but we need to know the target share. So when we look at existing target shares on this offense, what might be remaining, we'll start out by looking at all the starters. So Michael Wilson, rookie last year, had 13.7% of the target share and a 14.9 yards per reception. Just wanted to show that number to highlight that in this offense, a guy like Michael Wilson did have a rather high yards per reception number there, and that is capable when we start to look at what Marvin Harrison's yards per reception number might look like. And in the slot, it looks like Zay Jones is going to be fitting down in the slot. Greg Dortch will probably also get some work from the slot as well. He's not going to get work elsewhere. But I think it's Zay Jones. They brought him in, paid him. Greg Dortch was a guy who, at the start of last year, it didn't get any work. He was just not really a part of this offense. With injuries, then he ends up getting like 16% of the workload. So to me, I really like that 16% number. That kind of shows us maybe where Kyler Murray, the amount of times that he likes to hit that slot area. And then Chris Moore demanded 7.4% target share last year with Houston. I think they bring him in for a similar role this year on this offense. Just a guy who can stretch the defense and keep them honest and target a deep. And so I do expect this number to maybe go down a little bit from that 7.4%, but there we go. Then for the tight ends, Trey McBride, roughly 24.5% target share with Kyler Murray specifically at quarterback. And I do believe for James Conner, I also I looked at those numbers generally for these guys to see if there's any kind of big change. And so that is taken into account here. But also, they drafted Tip Ryman. I do expect him to get involved in this passing game a little bit, though he is going to start off as a better blocker. If you watch my offseason stuff, I think very highly of Tip Ryman and what his potential is in the passing game, and I hesitantly brought up the name George Kittle surrounding Tip Ryman, and I don't want that to be misplaced, so we'll just leave it at that. But I did hesitantly bring that name up as somebody to think about for the highest of high ends for a guy like Tip Ryman. Then when we look at the running back, James Conner got 8.6% of the target share, and then they also brought in Trey Benson, who I think will be getting some work in this offense, but also maybe feeding a little from that 8.6 target share off of James Conner's work. So we take all of those numbers. If we were to add those up, that's 72% of the target share. That leaves us with a 28% target share for Marvin Harrison Jr. to be able to absorb all of or some of, we'll see. And I actually did a little bit of freestyling as well with those numbers, then just kind of projecting forward what my expectations are for like a guy like Michael Wilson. That number might go up a little ways. Like I said, for Zay Jones, maybe that goes down for or maybe it stays the same, roughly at 18%. Chris Moore, maybe that number goes down a little bit. Tip Ryman, Trey Benson, maybe those numbers go up a little bit. You can see that, that tight end total share went up to 27% from that 24.5% for Trey McBride. Running back went from like 8.5% to 10% there. But in the end, I ended up with roughly the same darn number. So another instance of 28% to MHJ could be very viable as the target share that we could expect. But we'll take a little bit of a conservative approach here. We'll say 25% target share. You multiply that by 33.5 pass attempts, and that gets us to about 8 targets per game. A little over that, over 8.25. And if you were to catch about 65% of those passes, we get to about 5.5 receptions per game. So now we have our reception number. That is another number that we'll need because we're looking at half PPR here, but you can do your own little math from the numbers that I gave you and just, add another 2.25 points to the final half PPR score there for 5.5 points per game when we get to that point. But we need one more number for this calculation. That is the yardage. 13 yards per reception is an entirely average yards per reception number. It would be a top 45 wide receiver mark via the 2024 results. Guys like Calvin Ridley, Romeo Doubs, Drake London, Jordan Addison, and a bunch of slot wide receivers all finished with roughly 13 yards per reception. So that's a very doable number for a guy who, Marvin Harrison Jr., I'm sure he'll work out of the slot some, but he'll be out wide where the yards per reception should be actually a higher number than it would be if he was, running from the slot all the time. So this is a very reachable number, I think, to expect from MHA. And we also saw in this offense last year, Michael Wilson got about 15 yards per reception. So we know that there's even a higher outcome. But usually as those yards per reception go up, the receptions go down, and inversely the same thing. So that is always something to keep in mind. Now, we got the yards number here. We have roughly 13 yards per reception. We had the reception total, 5.5 receptions. That gets us to about 71.5 yards per game. So I think we've got all the numbers we need. No, not quite. We need our touchdown number. So over the career of Kyler Murray, which, he hasn't always finished seasons off, but his most touchdowns that he's thrown in a year have been 24. I think he did that twice. I think it was his first 2 years in the league that he had 24 touchdowns. And, of course, DeAndre Hopkins was on those teams, and DeAndre Hopkins averaged 7 touchdowns per year over a span of 26 games, which is about 1.5 years with Kyler Murray. He also averaged 12.9 yards per reception. So there you go. That gives another idea. That was a different offensive system, but still gives us an idea of what Kyler Murray, number 1 wide receiver, what we might be able to expect from him. About 13 yards per reception, not too shabby. Now, when we look at this touchdown number, I went with 4 touchdowns over 16 games. This wasn't a highly scientific number. This is just kind of at the lower end of my expectation. I think 4 to 8 is about what we should expect from Marvin Harrison Jr. this season, and that comes to roughly a quarter of a touchdown per game for the fantasy season. So we look at this lower end estimate. We've got 5.5 yards per reception, receptions per game times a half of a point per reception. You know how this goes. You cross out any numerators and denominators that are the same. So you cross out those receptions, and we get 2.75 points per game, because points is up there in the numerator spot. The game GM there down in the numerator. So you do that across the board here, 71.5 yards per game times 0.1 points per yard. We get 7.1 points. You take a quarter of a touchdown per game, you multiply that by 6 points per touchdown, and you get 1.5 points per game. You add up all those points per game there, and in half PPR, that comes to 11.35 points per game, which would have in 2023, that's a typo / I wrote in chalk the incorrect number there, and I can't erase it. In 2023, that would have gotten you a wide receiver 25 performance. Now, when we look at the higher end estimate here, let's say he gets 30% market share, which, by the way, is higher than any market share that DeAndre Hopkins ever got, but is not outside of the realm of possibility for the number one target on an offense. 30% is an elite number, essentially. But we also think that Marvin Harrison might be elite. And, the competition is basically Trey McBride. So it's possible that he were to get this, and we know that there's close to this amount available. So, higher end estimate, we take that 30% market share, multiply that by 33.5 targets per game. We'll keep that number the same. That gets us to 10 targets, which would get us to 6.5 receptions, which gets us to about 3.25 points per game instead here. Then you take our 14 yards per reception instead of the 13 yards. We increase that number to something still quite realistic, possible. Multiply that by the new number, the 6.5 receptions, and that gets us to 91 yards per game, which would be 9.1 points per game. Now, that would be a really high number to average, that 91 yards per game. That would put him in the top 5, most likely. Would have put him at 5, I believe, in 2023. So keep that in mind here for that number. But remember, we didn't increase the targets per game. That's a number that could go up. Same here with the touchdowns. I said I expect 4 to 8. So I think it's very possible that even 8 touchdowns here could increase. Those numbers could offset this, this yardage. That 91 yards per game that would put him as like the new highest rookie. He would break Puka Nakua's record from last season by like 75 yards or something like that, because I believe Puka averaged about 86 yards per reception. So anyways, 7 touchdowns per game comes to 2.6 points per game. You add all those up, that would be 14.95 points per game, which would be the wide receiver 6 via the results from the 2023 season in half PPR once again. So is the ADP worth it here for Marvin Harrison Jr.? He is currently going as the 14th highest player, which is actually the wide receiver 9. Can we justify that based on the numbers that we've got? Make up your own mind. Here's my answer. I think if we look at, what's the halfway point here between 6 and 24, that's 15. Wide receiver 9, that just feels like that's his ceiling. I will say I didn't calculate his absolute ceiling coming to that number 6 number. He could outperform that, I believe. And the floor there, I don't think is the ultimate floor. He could end up with more like 12 yards per reception, something a little bit lower than that 13 number. Very possible. He's not really known for his yak ability. That was not a strength of his in college. But I do want to point out, too, that these numbers are different. I did this separately. I didn't look at my projection numbers that I used. But when I look at my projection numbers, I give him a 25, almost and a quarter target share, so on the lower end there, but then I gave him 14 yards per reception, so on the higher end there, ended up with about 5.8 catches per game expectation at that, and he came out exactly to I believe it's exactly to my wide receiver. Yeah, it is 15 in the projections, which I don't look at touchdown numbers for. I think he's a little bit expected on the kind of the lower end for the touchdown number there, so maybe that would push him back a little bit, but I ended up ranking him 15th in my projections. So I think right there, if you can get him as wide receiver 15, 2 thumbs, maybe not even 2 thumbs up, but I think that's where you start to see the potential value. Right now, that's just a little bit too high for me. Thank you very much for tuning on in. Take care. Peace out.